Now, how's that for a happy face? A true and genuine, unfiltered expression of happiness? Well, probably not very convincing. And yet, sadly, that's the closest I got to turning myself into a physical or real world emoji version of my happy self. Which, by the way, you could try to do at home if you wanted. It's one of these few things that are not hazardous to try to do at home or emulate. In fact, some science suggests that if you can find a way to recreate or simulate happiness through your body language and your nonverbal communication, particularly your facial expressions, you may actually end up tricking or fooling your mind and brain into thinking that you're happy when in fact you're not. Which, let's face it, is probably as close to happiness as one can get. But do you even care about this? Do you even care about being a happier version of yourself? Do you want to be happier? This seems like a very stupid question to ask, not least because the majority of people would answer yes, so what's the point of asking this question? And yet, those same individuals habitually engage in a wide range of behaviors that do very little to increase their levels of happiness and quite a lot to increase their levels of unhappiness. Not to mention other people's unhappiness, but that's a whole different subject and I won't go there today. So, is there a clear correlation, maybe even a causal link between wanting happiness and attaining it? Oscar Wilde famously said that there's only two ways of being unhappy. One, not getting what you want, the other one, getting it. And throughout the relatively short course of human history, millennia or so, people have spent a long time trying to understand, define, measure, and increase happiness in themselves and others. So philosophers, psychologists, poets, artists, spiritual leaders, and scientists alike have tried to define happiness mostly around 4 or 5 major ways. So historically, happiness has been defined as the pursuit of pleasure, the avoidance of pains, the avoidance or extinction of desire. So if you can achieve a state of vegetable-like nirvana and you have no cravings, you might be happier, at least more content. A more meaningful and purposeful life. More recently, when the positive psychology movement started within scientific psychology, the concept has been self-actualization. So basically, if you can find a way to enter a state of flow and unleash your creative juices or become a more intelligent and grown-up version of yourself, you might be happier. Now, clearly, there's no universal formula to attaining happiness, which is why the world isn't becoming happier and happier decade after decade, although there are some signs that happiness level seems to be improving. Typically, when we measure this, at least mainstream scientists, and this is the approach followed by the UN and the World Health Organization or the World Bank, they just ask people a very simple question. On a 1 to 10 point scale, how satisfied are you with your life? And even though this seems like a very silly methodology, it actually predicts a whole range of real life relevant outcomes from future job satisfaction, job performance, relationship satisfaction, relationship success, even health related outcomes such as longevity and mortality. So the number you pick actually predicts how long you will live. Not perfectly, of course, but there is a statistical correlation there. So more recently, happiness has, of course, been hijacked by the consumerist society, whether we like to admit it or not. In fact, part of the consumerist society is to pretend that this isn't true. But happiness today has a much more materialistic and superficial connotation, which is why a lot of people experience it and convey it when they have managed to buy the latest thing they didn't need, or upgrade to the latest version of their iPhone, or get a free upgrade to a business class seat in a plane, if flying is, of course, still an option. Which is why when they share these happy news about their lives, other people become depressed because they have somehow assume that these are behaviors that lead to fulfillment and that they're much deeper than they actually are. One of the most interesting advancements or changes in recent decades, and it is a recent phenomenon, has been the fact that employers, so organizations, not just for-profit organizations, but employers or organizations in general, have seemed to engage or embark in deliberate attempts to increase employees' happiness. So does your boss care about your happiness? Does your employer really care about your happiness? It's tempting to think that the answer is yes. Not least because some organizations even have a formal role called Chief Happiness Officer, so clearly they must care. But actually, the only reason why employers might care or be interested in your happiness levels is if it actually makes you more productive and it increases your levels of job performance. You might have known this already and didn't need me to tell you this, but there are a lot of simple examples that might help you realize that when there is a gap between your happiness and your performance, employers will probably pick your performance and you will probably pick your happiness. So for example, I'm sure that a lot of employees around the world would be happier if they worked fewer hours, got paid more, changed their job or role title, and maybe even replaced their boss. But there's no indication that that would be of any benefit for the organization. And by the same token, it's often the employees who aren't that happy that provide the biggest value to the organization, the employer. So we know that the correlation between engagement or employee attitudes and job performance is typically in the 0.3 to 0.4 range, which means that there's less than 20% overlap between people's happiness and their performance. Finally, we should remember that to some degree, civilization and progress and anything that has ever been achieved that is of any value to society is probably the result and outcome of people who were relatively unhappy or dissatisfied with the status quo, which is why they tried hard to change things. So if your definition of happiness is to be lying around sipping cocktails in the beach in some remote island of the Pacific Ocean, that's probably good for you, but not very helpful for the rest of humanity. So maybe organizations should change from having a chief happiness officer to having a chief unhappiness officer, even though a lot of them are doing quite a bit already to making their employees unhappy.